The London season of 1855 had just begun, and Lady Clara Beaumont's absence from the customary balls and soirees was noted with particular interest by the ton. Whispers circulated through drawing rooms and behind fluttering fans about her sudden withdrawal from society. Had her father's recent financial collapse finally broken her spirit? Or was there a more scandalous reason for her disappearance? The answer arrived with the morning edition of the London Gazette, causing teacups to rattle and matrons to gasp throughout Mayfair. The Duke of Ingelwood to Wednesday. The headline alone was enough to cause a stir, as the notoriously reclusive Owen Ingelwood had sworn never to marry after his parents' disastrous union had ended in his mother's death and his father's subsequent suicide. But it was the subtext that caused the real sensation, arrangement of limited duration alleged. In the elegant but diminished drawing room of the Beaumont townhouse in Grosvenor Square, Clara read the news with a stiff upper lip, despite the mortification burning through her. "They make it sound so sordid," she said, folding the paper with deliberate care. "As though we are engaged in some indecent arrangement rather than a perfectly reasonable business transaction." Her father, Lord Beaumont, a once proud man now hunched by debt and disgrace, could not meet her eyes. Perhaps it was a mistake to agree to his terms. The Duke's reputation is precisely why this will work," Clara interrupted. "Everyone knows he has no wish for a true Duchess. And I have no wish for a true marriage. 1 year as his wife will restore our family's standing, pay your debts, and provide me with enough independence thereafter to live as I choose." She did not mention what they both knew, that at 26, with no dowry and her family's recent disgrace, her prospects for an advantageous marriage had evaporated like morning dew. The Duke's proposal, unconventional as it was, represented her family's only salvation. "He will be here at noon," Lord Beaumont said, his voice hollow. "The solicitors have prepared the contracts." Clara nodded, rising to prepare herself for the meeting. As she ascended the stairs to her chamber, she reminded herself of the terms. 1 year as the Duchess of Ingelwood. She would preside over his household, accompany him to necessary social functions, and present a united front to society. In return, her father's debts would be paid, and she would receive a generous settlement upon the dissolution of their arrangement, enough to live independently for the rest of her life. There would be no physical expectations, the Duke had made that abundantly clear. Indeed, his distaste for marriage seemed to extend to all intimate relations. The gossips claimed he had not taken a lover in the 10 years since he'd inherited the dukedom at the age of 23. A business arrangement, Clara whispered to herself as her lady's maid helped her into a dove-grey walking dress. Nothing more. At precisely noon, the Duke of Ingelwood was announced. Clara descended the stairs with practiced grace, her expression composed into polite interest, as though she were greeting any casual visitor rather than her future husband. Owen Ingelwood stood in the center of their faded drawing-room like a statue carved of marble, tall, imposing, and seemingly just as cold. His dark hair was immaculately styled, his clothing of the finest quality but devoid of fashionable excess. Only his eyes betrayed any humanity, a startling blue that assessed her with analytical precision. "Lady Clara," he said, bowing precisely. "You are punctual. I appreciate that quality." "Your Grace," she curtsied, noting how he flinched almost imperceptibly at the title. "I believe in honoring commitments promptly, whether they be social calls or business arrangements." A flicker of something, perhaps approval, crossed his features before vanishing into impassivity. "Then we understand each other. Shall we proceed with the contracts?" For the next hour, Clara sat beside her father as the Duke's solicitor outlined the terms of their arrangement. The language was clinical, the conditions exacting. Clara would have all the privileges of a duchess but none of the security of a true wife. After 1 year, they would separate quietly, citing incompatibility. She would retire to a property in Devon with an annual allowance. "And if I should bear a child?" Clara asked suddenly, causing her father to choke on his tea. The Duke's expression did not change, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped his walking stick. "The agreement clearly states there will be no marital relations, Lady Clara." "Agreements, like rules, are occasionally broken, Your Grace," she replied evenly. "I merely wish to understand all contingencies." His gaze locked with hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes, a flash of respect, perhaps. "Any child born of our union would, of course, be my heir and provided for accordingly. The settlement would be adjusted to reflect your status as the mother of my child." Clara nodded, satisfied. "Then I believe we understand each other perfectly." 2 weeks later, Clara stood in the Grand Cathedral of St. George's, reciting vows she had no intention of honoring beyond their literal interpretation. The Duke's hand was steady as he placed the ring on her finger, but she noticed his pulse fluttering rapidly at his temple. Not so unmoved after all, she thought. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair at Ingelwood House, the Duke's imposing London residence. The guests, mostly business associates and distant relations, seemed uncertain whether to offer congratulations or condolences, given the unusual circumstances of the match. "You play your role admirably," the Duke murmured as they stood receiving guests. "One might almost believe you entered this arrangement with enthusiasm." "Resignation can often be mistaken for enthusiasm, Your Grace," Clara replied softly. "But I assure you, I am fully committed to our agreement." That evening, as Clara was shown to her chambers, a suite of rooms adjacent to but separate from the Duke's, she allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. The Duke had been correct in his assessment, she had played her part well. Perhaps too well. The reality of her situation now pressed upon her like the weight of her wedding gown. For 1 year, she would be a duchess in name only, living in proximity to a man who viewed their marriage as nothing more than a convenient fiction. The Duke had been clear about his motivations. He needed a duchess to satisfy the terms of his father's will, which required him to marry before his 35th birthday or lose control of certain family properties. Clara needed financial security and social rehabilitation. It was, as they both had said repeatedly, a business arrangement. Yet as Clara dismissed her lady's maid and stood alone in the opulent bedchamber, she wondered if she had underestimated the challenge of living such a carefully constructed lie. The first weeks of their marriage established a pattern of polite distance. The Duke rose early, spent his days attending to his extensive business interests, and returned late. Clara assumed the responsibilities of managing his household with quiet efficiency, making small but significant improvements to the running of Ingelwood House. Their interactions were limited to occasional meals and the necessary public appearances. At these functions, they presented themselves as a contented, if reserved, couple. The Duke was unfailingly courteous, offering his arm when required, introducing her appropriately, and even occasionally engaging her in conversation that went beyond mere pleasantries. "You've redecorated the East drawing room," he remarked one evening as they returned from the opera. Clara glanced up in surprise. "Yes, I thought it would benefit from more light." The heavy draperies were quite oppressive. "It's an improvement," he said after a moment. "The house has been stagnant since my mother's death." It was the most personal statement he had made since their wedding, and Clara found herself suddenly curious about the man behind the ducal facade. Did she prefer the darker aesthetic? A shadow crossed his face. "No. My mother loved light and color. After her death, my father had everything changed, draped in mourning that never ended." Clara hesitated, then said softly, "Perhaps we might restore some of her preferences? If you have any records of how the house was arranged during her time." The Duke studied her with an unreadable expression. "Why would you concern yourself with such matters? Our arrangement is temporary." "Because I live here now," Clara answered simply. "And while I do, I would prefer to inhabit a home rather than a mausoleum to grief." She thought he might be angered by her frankness, but after a long moment, he nodded. "There are watercolors my mother painted of various rooms. I shall have them brought from storage." The next day, a dusty portfolio was delivered to Clara's sitting room. Inside, she found delicate watercolors depicting Ingelwood House as it had been, filled with light, adorned with fresh flowers, and decorated in soft, warm tones rather than the current somber palette. Over the following weeks, Clara gradually implemented changes inspired by the Duchess's paintings. She half expected resistance from the Duke or the long-serving staff, but instead found cautious approval, even gratitude from the older servants who remembered the house in happier days. The Duke himself said nothing, but Clara occasionally caught him pausing in doorways, his gaze lingering on newly uncovered windows or replaced furnishings with an expression that might almost be described as wistful. 3 months into their arrangement, the rhythms of their separate lives began, almost imperceptibly, to synchronize. The Duke adjusted his schedule to join Clara for breakfast several times a week. Clara found herself lingering in the library in the evenings, knowing he often retired there after dinner. Their conversations, once limited to household matters and social obligations, gradually expanded. The Duke, Clara discovered, possessed a sharp intelligence and unexpected wit when he chose to display it. He, in turn, seemed surprised by her interest in politics and commerce. "Most ladies of your station confine their reading to poetry and novels," he remarked one evening as he found her absorbed in a treatise on economic theory. "Most ladies of my station have not watched their father lose a fortune through poor investments," Clara replied without rancour. "I determined some time ago to understand the mechanisms that can elevate or destroy a family's security." The Duke considered this, then crossed to a cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound ledger. "Perhaps you might offer your perspective on some investments I'm considering in the northern manufacturing districts." Clara looked up in genuine surprise. "You would value my opinion on such matters?" "I value informed opinions, regardless of their source," he said matter-of-factly. "And you have demonstrated a capacity for clear thinking that is uncommon." She accepted the ledger, oddly touched by what, from him, constituted high praise. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Owen," he said abruptly. "When we are alone, you might call me Owen." Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest. "Then you must call me Clara." He nodded once, sharply, as though concluding a business negotiation rather than initiating a new intimacy. But that evening marked a subtle shift in their relationship, from a partnership of convenience to something approaching friendship. As summer approached, they relocated to Ingelwood Park, the Duke's country estate in Hampshire. Here, away from the scrutinizing eyes of London society, the artificial nature of their arrangement seemed less pronounced. The expansive grounds offered opportunities for shared activities, horseback riding in the mornings, walks in the extensive gardens, even occasional picnics by the lake. On one such occasion, as they sat beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, Clara found herself studying the Duke, Owen, as he gazed across the water. The perpetual tension he carried in London had eased somewhat in the country air. She noticed for the first time the small lines at the corners of his eyes, not from age, he was only 34, but from some private strain he carried. "You seem more at peace here," she observed. He glanced at her, then returned his gaze to the lake. "This estate was my mother's favorite. My father rarely came here after her death. Perhaps that's why it feels untainted." "Your parents' marriage was unhappy," Clara ventured, aware she was treading on territory they had tacitly agreed to avoid. Owen was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as though recounting facts from a distant history rather than his own life. "My father was 20 years older than my mother. She was forced into the marriage by her family's financial circumstances, not unlike yourself." He paused. "Unlike our arrangement, however, there was no agreed endpoint to her sentence." Clara absorbed this in silence, understanding for the first time why he had structured their marriage as he had. She was unhappy. She withered, Owen said simply. "Year by year, I watched her spirit diminish under my father's possessive control. When she died, he stopped abruptly. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. "I shouldn't have pried." Owen shook his head. "It's rather absurd that we are married, yet know so little of each other's histories." He turned to face her directly. "What of your parents' union? Was it a love match?" Clara smiled sadly. "Yes, though perhaps that was part of the problem. My father adored my mother so completely that after her death, he sought to fill the void she left with increasingly desperate measures, gambling, speculative investments, anything to distract from his grief. His love for her destroyed him and nearly destroyed our family. And that is why you have such a practical view of marriage," Owen said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I believe passionate attachments often lead to poor decisions," Clara confirmed. "Our arrangement, with its clear boundaries and defined conclusion, seems far more sensible." Owen nodded slowly. "Indeed. Most sensible." Yet as he helped her to her feet, his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, and Clara found herself oddly breathless at the contact. The Hampshire summer unfurled in long, golden days that seemed to exist outside the constraints of their agreement. Clara found herself looking forward to their daily interactions, the discussions over breakfast about estate matters, the occasional shared reading in the library during rainy afternoons, the evening walks through the rose gardens. Owen, too, seemed to shed some of his reserve. He spoke more freely of his childhood, his education, the weight of responsibility that had fallen on him after his father's death. In turn, Clara shared stories of her own upbringing, the happy years before her mother's passing, her father's decline, her own efforts to maintain their diminishing household with dignity. "You were placed in an impossible position," Owen observed one evening as they sat in the music room, Clara having just finished playing a melancholy Chopin nocturne. "Managing a household in decline, watching your father's self-destruction, all while maintaining appearances for society's benefit." Clara's fingers stilled on the pianoforte keys. "It taught me resilience, at least." "And to distrust emotion," Owen added softly. She looked up, startled by his perception. "Perhaps. Though I might say the same of you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we are well matched in our wariness, if nothing else." As July turned to August, Clara began to notice subtle changes in their interactions. Owen's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't aware. His hand at her elbow as they walked the garden seemed to convey a protectiveness beyond mere courtesy. Once, when she laughed at something he said, a look of such wonder crossed his face that Clara felt her heart skip a beat. These moments were brief, almost imperceptible, and neither acknowledged them directly. Yet Clara found herself taking more care with her appearance each morning, choosing gowns she knew complemented her coloring, arranging her hair in styles he had once casually admired. It was madness, she told herself sternly. Their arrangement had clear terms. In less than 6 months, they would return to London, complete the final social obligations of the season, and then quietly separate. Any growing attachment would only complicate what had been designed to be simple. The realization that her feelings for Owen had progressed beyond the boundaries of their agreement came suddenly, during a violent summer storm. Thunder crashed overhead as rain lashed against the windows of Ingelwood Park. Clara, who had always harbored a childish fear of storms, sat rigidly in the library, pretending to read while her nerves jangled with each lightning flash. Owen entered, carrying a brandy decanter and 2 glasses. "I thought you might appreciate something to steady your nerves," he said, setting a glass before her. Clara looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" "You've been turning pages too quickly to actually be reading," he observed, taking the seat opposite her. "And you flinch each time the thunder sounds." An embarrassing weakness, Clara admitted, accepting the brandy gratefully. "My mother used to sit with me during storms. After she died, there was no one." Owen studied her over the rim of his glass. "There is someone now." The simple statement, delivered without embellishment or expectation, touched Clara more deeply than any elaborate declaration could have. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. "Thank you," she said softly. They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside, the brandy warming Clara from within. When a particularly violent thunderclap shook the windows, she startled visibly. Without comment, Owen moved to sit beside her on the sofa. His proximity offered comfort without presumption, and Clara found herself gradually relaxing despite the continuing storm. "Tell me about your plans," Owen said after a while. "After our arrangement concludes." The question caught Clara off guard. They rarely spoke of the future that lay beyond their year together. "I suppose I shall retire to the Devon property as agreed. Perhaps travel a bit. I've always wanted to see Italy." "Alone?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "That was the understanding," Clara replied, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how the firelight cast his features into sharp relief. "Unless you're concerned about my reputation." "No," Owen said slowly. "I find myself concerned about your happiness." Clara's breath caught. "My happiness is not part of our arrangement, Owen." He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "What if I wish it were?" Before Clara could respond, the library door opened, and the butler appeared with an urgent message. A tenant farm had been struck by lightning, and the family had barely escaped the resulting fire. The moment broken, they both rose to respond to the crisis. But as they worked together through the night, organizing shelter for the displaced family, arranging for immediate repairs, comforting the frightened children, Clara was acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The following days brought no opportunity to revisit their interrupted conversation. The aftermath of the storm created numerous demands on the estate, and Owen was fully occupied with restoration efforts. Clara threw herself into coordinating relief for the affected tenants, working closely with the local vicar to collect necessities for the displaced family. Yet there was a new awareness between them when they did interact, fleeting glances, accidental touches that lingered, conversations that danced around the edges of deeper feelings without quite acknowledging them. It was during this period of unspoken tension that the letter arrived from London. Clara recognized her father's handwriting immediately and opened it with a sense of foreboding that proved justified. Lord Beaumont, despite the settlement of his previous debts, had managed to accumulate new ones through renewed gambling. He wrote requesting an advance on Clara's settlement, money that, according to their agreement, she would not receive until after the year-long marriage concluded. Clara sat in her private sitting room, the letter crushed in her hand, fighting tears of frustration. She had believed her father's promises to reform, had hoped that freeing him from financial burden would allow him to find purpose beyond the gaming tables. His betrayal of that hope cut deeply. "Clara!" Owen's voice came from the doorway. "Simon said you received troubling news." She hastily wiped her eyes, but not quickly enough to hide her distress. "It's nothing of consequence." Owen crossed the room in 3 strides, his expression concerned. "Clearly untrue. What's happened?" After a moment's hesitation, Clara handed him the crumpled letter. As he read, his face hardened into the remote mask she had not seen since their early days in London. "I see," he said finally. "Your father requires more money." "I'm sorry," Clara said automatically. "I had no idea he would." "Why are you apologizing?" Owen interrupted. "His actions are not your responsibility." "But our agreement was to pay his existing debts, which I did," Owen said firmly. "It included no provision for enabling future recklessness." Clara nodded miserably. "Of course. I'll write to him explaining that." Owen studied her for a long moment. "You feel responsible for him?" It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "He's my father. For all his flaws, he raised me after my mother died. He did his best, I think. His best included gambling away your dowry and forcing you into a marriage of convenience, Owen pointed out, a edge to his voice. A marriage that has benefited you as well, Clara reminded him quietly. Your fathers will require you to marry before your 35th birthday. Our arrangement satisfied that condition. Something flashed in Owen's eyes, hurt, perhaps, or anger. Yes, a mutually beneficial business transaction. How could I forget? He turned to leave, but Clara rose and caught his arm. Owen, I didn't mean. What did you mean, Clara? He asked, his voice suddenly tired. What is this arrangement to you now? Still merely a contract to be fulfilled? Or has it become something else? The question hung between them, charged with all the unspoken feelings of the past months. Clara wanted to answer truthfully, to admit that somewhere between London and Hampshire, between winter and summer, between obligation and choice, she had begun to care for him in ways that terrified her. But the habits of self-protection were deeply ingrained. I don't know, she whispered. Owen's expression shuttered. Then perhaps it's best we maintain the original terms without further complications. He withdrew his arm from her grasp and left the room, his back straight as a blade. Clara sank back into her chair, feeling as though something precious had slipped through her fingers before she'd fully recognized its value. The next morning, Owen announced his intention to return to London on urgent business. Though he invited Clara to accompany him, his manner was so formal that she declined, claiming a preference for the country air. In truth, she couldn't bear to return to the rigid performance of their early marriage, now that she had glimpsed the possibility of something genuine between them. After Owen's departure, Ingelwood Park seemed emptier than its vast spaces warranted. Clara continued her work with the tenants, rode daily through the estate, and read extensively from the library's collection. But each activity only emphasized Owen's absence, the projects they had discussed together, the paths they had ridden side by side, the books they had debated in the evenings. A week into his absence, Clara received another letter from her father, this one more desperate in tone. He spoke of threatening creditors and hinted at physical danger. Despite her resolution not to enable his behavior, Clara found herself deeply worried. After a sleepless night, she made a decision. She would travel to London, assess the situation personally, and if necessary, appeal to Owen for assistance, not as an entitlement, but as a genuine request. The journey to London was long and provided ample time for reflection. As the countryside gave way to the sprawling city, Clara considered how much had changed since she had left as a new bride 5 months earlier. She had entered the marriage as a practical solution to mutual problems. Now, she was returning with her heart uncomfortably engaged and no clear understanding of Owen's feelings. Clara directed the carriage first to her father's townhouse in Grosvenor Square, where she was dismayed to find the property shuttered, with a notice of seizure affixed to the door. The neighbouring houses yielded no information about Lord Beaumont's whereabouts, and Clara found herself increasingly concerned. Finally, a former footman, now employed by a neighbouring family, provided the answer. Lord Beaumont had taken rooms in a disreputable area near the docks, fleeing his creditors but unable to abandon London's gaming hells entirely. With trepidation, Clara directed her driver to the address. The neighbourhood was indeed squalid, a far cry from the elegant squares where she had spent her youth. When she located the dingy lodging house, the landlady informed her that Lord Beaumont had not been seen for 3 days, though his belongings remained. Increasingly worried, Clara reluctantly decided she must seek Owen's assistance. She directed the carriage to Ingelwood House, rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain her concern without appearing to demand his intervention. But upon arrival, she was informed by the butler that His Grace was not at home. Further questioning revealed that the Duke had not, in fact, been in residence at all since returning to London. He had taken rooms at his club and left instructions that household matters should be directed to his solicitor. Confused and hurt by this revelation, why had Owen not stayed at their London home? Clara left her card and returned to the carriage, uncertain of her next move. As twilight descended over the city, she made a decision: she would go to Owen's club. It was highly improper for a lady to call at such an establishment, but propriety seemed less important than resolving the mysteries of both her father's disappearance and her husband's avoidance. At the exclusive gentlemen's club on St. James Street, Clara's appearance caused considerable consternation. The doorman was scandalized, the footman aghast. Only the unexpected intervention of Lord Harrington, an elderly peer who had known Clara since childhood, prevented her immediate ejection. "My dear Lady Clara, or rather, Your Grace," he corrected himself with a bow. "What extraordinary circumstance brings you to these hallowed masculine domains?" "I must speak with my husband urgently," Clara explained, grateful for the familiar face. "It concerns my father." Lord Harrington's expression grew serious. "Ah, yes. Lord Beaumont's difficulties have been the subject of some concern. Perhaps it would be best if you waited in the visitors' parlour while I fetch your husband." Clara allowed herself to be led to a small, rarely used room near the entrance, designed for those brief, unavoidable moments when ladies might need to communicate with club members. She paced the confined space anxiously, rehearsing explanations that grew increasingly inadequate. When the door finally opened, it was not Owen who entered but Lord Harrington, his expression grave. "I'm afraid the Duke is not currently at the club," he said apologetically. "However, I believe I may know something of your father's situation." Clara sat down abruptly, fear tightening her chest. "Please, tell me." Lord Harrington joined her, his manner gentle but direct. "Your father lost heavily at cards 3 nights ago, to a man with a notorious reputation for collecting debts by any means necessary. There was an altercation. Lord Beaumont was injured." "Injured?" Clara repeated, her voice barely audible. "How severely? Where is he now?" "He was taken to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The last I heard, his condition was serious but not critical." Clara rose immediately. "I must go to him." "My carriage is at your disposal," Lord Harrington offered. "And perhaps you would allow me to accompany you? St. Bartholomew's is not in an area where a lady should travel unescorted, especially at this hour." Gratefully accepting his assistance, Clara was soon on her way to the ancient hospital in Smithfield. As their carriage navigated the darkening streets, her mind raced with questions. Why had Owen not been at his club? Did he know about her father's situation? And why had he chosen to avoid Ingelwood House upon his return to London? At the hospital, Clara was directed to a ward where her father lay pale and diminished in a narrow bed, his head bandaged and one arm in a splint. He was asleep or unconscious, and the attending physician informed her that he had suffered a severe concussion and broken arm when he was accidentally pushed down a flight of stairs after an argument over gambling debts. "He's been asking for you, Your Grace," the physician added. "And for the Duke." "The Duke?" Clara asked, puzzled. "Why would he ask for my husband?" The physician looked equally confused. "I assumed you knew. The Duke of Ingelwood has been here daily, arranging for your father's care and settling with the hospital administration. He left only an hour ago." Clara sank into the chair beside her father's bed, trying to make sense of this information. Owen had been caring for her father, the very man whose reckless behavior had necessitated their marriage of convenience. Why would he do this without informing her? Lord Harrington, who had been speaking with a hospital administrator, returned with additional information. "It seems your husband has done more than arrange for medical care," he said quietly. "He has also settled Lord Beaumont's outstanding debts and made arrangements with the creditor who assaulted him. The man will face charges." Clara's eyes filled with tears of confusion and gratitude. "I don't understand. Why wouldn't he tell me?" "Perhaps," Lord Harrington suggested gently, "you should ask him yourself." After ensuring her father was receiving the best possible care and leaving instructions to be notified of any change in his condition, Clara allowed Lord Harrington to escort her back to Ingelwood House. The elderly peer declined her invitation to enter, mentioning only that he believed the Duke might have returned in their absence. The grand townhouse was largely darkened when Clara arrived, with only a few essential lamps lit in the entrance hall. The butler informed her that His Grace had indeed returned a short while ago and was in his study, with instructions not to be disturbed. "Nevertheless, Simmons, I believe he will see me," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "No need to announce me." Making her way through the familiar corridors, Clara was struck by how different the house felt from the austere mausoleum she had first encountered. Even in the dim evening light, the changes she had implemented were evident: lighter draperies, refreshed furnishings, arrangements of fresh flowers. It had become a home rather than a monument to grief. Outside the study door, Clara hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if Owen's care for her father was merely duty, not affection? What if his avoidance of the house was a deliberate distancing from her? What if the feelings that had grown in her heart were entirely one-sided? Drawing a deep breath, she knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. Owen stood by the window, silhouetted against the night sky, a glass of brandy in his hand. He turned at her entrance, his expression shifting from surprise to concern to wariness in rapid succession. "Clara," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I didn't expect you in London." "Evidently," she replied, closing the door behind her. "Yet you've been attending to my father's welfare without informing me." Owen set down his glass and moved toward his desk, putting a physical barrier between them. "I received word of his situation and acted accordingly. It seemed unnecessary to trouble you when there was nothing you could do from Hampshire. Unnecessary to trouble me with news that my father had been assaulted and hospitalized?" Clara asked incredulously. "Or unnecessary to reveal that you were personally intervening on his behalf?" Owen's jaw tightened. "Both, perhaps." Clara studied him, trying to penetrate the formal mask he had reassumed. "Why, Owen? Why would you help a man you clearly disdain, then hide your actions from me?" "Because it mattered to you," he said simply. "Your concern for him, despite his failings, is one of the qualities He stopped abruptly. "One of the qualities you what?" Clara pressed, her heart suddenly racing. Owen looked away, his profile rigid with tension. "One of the qualities I admire," he finished carefully. Clara took a step toward him, then another, until only the desk separated them. "Is that why you've avoided this house since returning to London? Because you admire me?" His hands gripped the edge of the desk. "I've been preoccupied with business matters." "You're lying," Clara said softly. "You forget how well I've come to know you these past months." Owen's gaze snapped back to hers, something dangerous flickering in their depths. "Do you know me, that is?" "I believe I do," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know you value honesty and despise weakness. I know you care deeply for your tenants and employees, though you hide it behind a facade of ducal authority. I know you prefer coffee to tea, poetry to prose, and rainy days to sunny ones because they remind you of your mother." With each observation, Owen's expression grew more unguarded, the mask slipping to reveal the man beneath. "I know," Clara continued, moving around the desk to stand directly before him, "that our arrangement has become something neither of us anticipated. And I know you've been avoiding Ingelwood House because it's filled with reminders of what we've shared, what we could share, if we allowed ourselves to acknowledge it." Owen remained utterly still, his breathing shallow. "And what is that, precisely?" Clara summoned all her courage. "Affection. Understanding. Perhaps even, don't," Owen interrupted, his voice rough. "Don't say what cannot be unsaid." "Why not?" Clara challenged. "Are you so committed to honoring the letter of our agreement that you would deny what has grown between us?" "Our agreement was designed specifically to prevent complications of emotion," Owen reminded her, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. To protect both of us from the very entanglements that destroyed our parents. And yet here we are, Clara said quietly. Entangled despite our best intentions. Owen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Here we are, he echoed. Clara reached up slowly, giving him every opportunity to withdraw, and touched his cheek. I'm not asking you to violate our agreement, Owen. When the year ends, if you still wish to part ways, I will honor that. But I cannot pretend that my feelings for you are merely those of a business partner or even a friend. Owen closed his eyes briefly at her touch, then covered her hand with his own. What are you proposing, Clara? That for the remainder of our year, we allow ourselves to explore what might be possible between us, not as a Duchess and Duke fulfilling an obligation, but as Clara and Owen discovering if there might be a future neither of us planned for. The silence that followed seemed endless. Clara could feel the rapid beat of her heart, the warmth of Owen's hand over hers, the precipice on which they both stood. Finally, Owen spoke, his voice low and certain. I avoided this house because everywhere I looked, I saw you. In the changes you've made, in the life you've breathed into these rooms, in the empty spaces where you should have been. I helped your father not out of duty but because I couldn't bear to see you hurt by his actions. And I fought my growing feelings for you because I feared, he broke off, struggling visibly with words that did not come easily to him. What did you fear? Clara prompted gently. That I would become my father, Owen admitted. Possessive, controlling, suffocating the very spirit that drew me to you. Or that you would come to resent me, as my mother resented him. Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes. Oh, Owen. I am not your mother, and you are not your father. Our parents' failures don't doom us to repeat their mistakes. How can you be certain, he asked, vulnerability naked in his face. Because we entered this union with open eyes and honest terms, Clara said firmly. Because we've built something these past months on mutual respect and genuine understanding. And because, she smiled tremulously, I believe I've fallen in love with you, Owen Ingelwood, despite all my practical intentions to the contrary. The admission hung in the air between them, irrevocable and transformative. Owen's expression shifted from vulnerability to wonder to something Clara had never seen before, a joy so profound it illuminated his features from within. Clara, he breathed, cupping her face in his hands. My practical, sensible, unexpected Clara. I've loved you since you told me you preferred homes to mausoleums. Perhaps even before that. And then he was kissing her, tenderly at first, then with increasing passion as Clara responded with equal fervor. All the unspoken feelings of the past months found expression in that embrace, the growing affection, the reluctant admiration, the unexpected discovery of compatibility beyond their arrangement. When they finally drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, Owen pressed his forehead to hers. This changes everything, you understand. Clara nodded. I know. The terms of our agreement can be renegotiated, Clara finished for him. Isn't that what competent business partners do when circumstances change? Owen laughed, the sound rich with genuine happiness. And what terms would you propose, Your Grace? Clara pretended to consider. Well, the 1-year limitation seems rather arbitrary now. Perhaps an indefinite extension? And the separate living arrangements appear unnecessarily complicated. What of your independence? Owen asked more seriously. Your plans for travel, for a life beyond the constraints of ducal obligations. I find, Clara said thoughtfully, that independence means little without someone to share it with. As for travel, I still wish to see Italy. But I prefer to see it with you beside me. Owen's smile was radiant. I believe those terms are acceptable. He grew solemn again. Your father will need to find his own path to redemption, Clara said firmly. We'll provide support, but not enablement. Together. Together, Owen agreed, drawing her close again. I never imagined when I proposed our arrangement that it would lead to this. Nor did I, Clara admitted. But it seems our hearts had plans of their own, quite independent of our practical arrangements. In the months that followed, Owen and Clara transformed their marriage of convenience into a genuine partnership. Lord Beaumont, sobered by his near-death experience and his daughter's firm but compassionate boundaries, finally sought help for his gambling addiction through a discreet establishment recommended by Lord Harrington. When the one-year anniversary of their marriage arrived, Owen and Clara celebrated not with the dissolution of their union but with a renewal of their vows, this time with genuine promises of lifelong commitment rather than time-limited terms. The London Gazette, which had once reported their unusual arrangement with barely concealed scandal, now published a far different notice. The Duke and Duchess of Ingelwood announced the impending birth of their first child, expected in the spring. And in the privacy of their bedchamber at Ingelwood Park, as autumn leaves drifted past their window, Clara rested in her husband's arms, her hand covering his where it lay protectively over her slightly rounded abdomen. "Are you happy?" Owen murmured against her hair. Clara turned in his embrace, her eyes shining with certainty. Beyond all practical calculation, she assured him, and sealed the truth of it with a kiss.